can just let us know when it shows us recording on your end.
You should see it as well, I think so.
Here we go. All right, Kendra, you're up.
Good evening. We are so pleased that you have joined us for this webinar on positive, space, and healthy relationships as part of the Healthy Relationships campaign. Your local military family services team, along with PSP Health Promotion Team and Family Violence Advisory Team, have worked together to launch local campaign activities such as the Hold Me Tight virtual licenses, parenting self-regulation course for military families, and the Family Violence Resources Card, to name a few. Lastly, we'd like to encourage you to check out the Healthy Relationship Campaign website to get inspired. To learn about ways you can strengthen your relationship and rediscover the many supports available to CAF members and their families. The link will be shared in this chat for you to explore. So we're thrilled this evening to introduce you to Lieutenant Commander Irwin. He joined the Canadian Armed Forces in 2010. He has served in Kingston, Ottawa, Gagetown, and Petawawa. In 2020, he deployed on an op impact before being posted to CANSOFCOM in 2021. In addition to being a chaplain, he is also a registered psychotherapist with the College of Registered Psychotherapists of Ontario. Presently, he works as a clinical chaplain for CANSOFCOM. Bonsoir, nous sommes ravis que vous vous soyez joints à nous pour ce webinaire sur l'espace positif et les relations saines dans le cadre de la campagne sur les relations saines. Votre équipe locale de service aux familles des militaires, l'équipe de promotion de la santé PSP et l'équipe consultative sur la violence familiale ont travaillé ensemble pour lancer des activités locales dans le cadre de la campagne, comme les licences virtuelles serment fort, le cours d'autorégulation parentale pour les familles des militaires et la carte des ressources sur la violence familiale, pour n'en nommer que quelques-unes. Enfin, nous aimerions vous encourager à consulter le site web de la campagne Relations saines pour vous inspirer, découvrir les moyens de renforcer vos relations et redécouvrir les nombreux soutiens offerts aux membres des FAC et à leurs familles. Le lien sera partagé dans la boîte de dialogue pour que vous puissiez explorer. Et maintenant, nous sommes ravis de vous présenter Lieutenant Commandant Irwin. Il a rejoint les forces armées canadiennes en 2010. Il a servi à Kingston, Ottawa, Gagetown et Petawawa. En 2020, il a été déployé sur un Op Impact avant d'être affecté au CANSOFCOM en 2021. En plus d'être un aumônier, il est également un psychothérapeute agréé par l'Ordre des psychothérapeutes agréé de l'Ontario. Il travaille actuellement comme aumônier clinique pour le CANSOFCOM. Merci. Thank you, Troy. You can begin. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you. It's great to be here, and thanks for inviting me and giving me an opportunity to be with you and to talk a little bit about positive space and healthy relationships. So part of what I've put together here just comes from my own work as a psychotherapist. I believe strongly in relationships. I do couples counseling, for example, and then just in relationships in general. So part of it is just giving a background on the importance of healthy relationships. That'll be the first thing that we talk about, because what we discover is healthy relationships are critical to our mental health and our functioning. And when we're not in a position where those kinds of relationships come easily, that really has a negative impact upon our overall wellness and our ability to function. The other part of this presentation has come from the Positive Space Ambassador workshop that D&D runs. I was part of the initial pilot project when that workshop was launched in 2017, that training. I became a Positive Space Ambassador and also trained the trainer. This program is actually being updated right now, and this fall a new version will be out. But in the meantime, I have taken some of the information from that particular training and combined it with some things that I'd worked on in terms of the importance of relationships to present what this is. So it's a bit of a mix of some Positive Space Ambassador information along with some information information about healthy relationships. And so we'll talk about the importance of the healthy relationships. We'll talk about some terminology around the 2SLGBTQI plus movement, and that's a mouthful. I'll do my best to say it. Sometimes I'll just shorthand that with the community or something like that. And in case people have not seen this new terminology, 2SLGBTQI plus, that's what we've adopted officially as a country now. I believe it was in August when this became the new terminology. Previous to that, it was LGBTQ2 plus. And what's happened is the two at the end, which stood for two-spirited, we'll talk a little bit more about that, has been put at the beginning. So the 2S stands for two-spirited. And then at the end, the I has been added, which stands for intersex. So we will talk a little bit about those things and terminology in general. We'll talk about a history of the community, its movements, and how they gained rights within our country, why it's important to have positive space, and how to create healthy relationships in that context. And then there's just one slide about the positive space program itself. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, the importance of healthy relationships. I think probably most of us recognize who that is. That's Wilson, right? And if you remember the movie Castaway, Tom Hanks's character is marooned on a desert island, and he ends up creating from a volleyball from this plane crash that floated onto the beach along with a lot of other stuff. He takes his volleyball and he ends up making a companion out of it. And the majority of the movie is really Tom Hanks talking to this volleyball. And it's really interesting that if you've seen the movie, it's believable. You watch this man create a companion out of a volleyball, name it Wilson, talk to this volleyball, and as an audience, we're like, yeah, that kind of makes sense. And really interesting is that the crux of the movie, the emotional crux of the movie, is actually when Tom Hanks's character is finally built a raft. He's getting off the island, and he's bringing Wilson with him. And he falls asleep, and Wilson ends up floating away. And Tom Hanks jumps into the water. He tries to save Wilson. He's unable to save Wilson, and he has an absolute meltdown on the raft. And try to imagine if you were trying to pitch this story to a movie studio, and you say, okay, I got this idea for a story, and you explain what's going to happen. You explain that most of the movie is going to be Tom Hanks talking to a volleyball. And then oh, I just see I got a message coming up. Hold on. I'm not seeing them. Someone might have to read that to me. For some reason, my messages aren't appearing. Oh, here we go. There we go. Sorry about that. Okay, and you're pitching this to the movie studio, and you explain to them that Tom Hanks's character is going to spend a big chunk of the movie having a relationship with a volleyball, and that the emotional climax is going to come when this volleyball floats away and he loses it. You might be thinking, is that really the emotional highlight of this movie? Given everything that he's lost, is this really the moment where the audience is going to be moved to tears? Well, it works. I remember watching it. Yeah, I was teary-eyed watching this volleyball float away from Tom Hanks. And I guess the thing to consider is how come that relationship is believable and that emotional scene works so well, besides the fact that Tom Hanks is a wonderful actor. It's because we all know instinctively the deep need we have for human relationships. Our need to bond, our need to form connections is so deep, so profound, so part of what we are as human beings that, yeah, we believe someone could have a relationship with a volleyball, talk to it, fight with it. They have a big fight at one scene, and actually break down and sob when that volleyball floats away. And so we believe it, and it's believable, and it works because we know instinctively that That is how profound our need to connect is. Next slide. Okay, let's talk a little bit about sort of the evolution of how we bond as a species. We'll begin by going back to the reptile world. And think about this. When reptiles are born, what does it look like? Well, the mother lays eggs, and in the vast majority of cases, the mother disappears. And that's it. And eventually the eggs hatch, the reptiles are born, there's no one around but them, and it's basically welcome to the world and kind of good luck, all the best, and I hope you survive. And so the bonding or the connecting is basically not present. There's no parent around, you just hatch and here's the world and go out and make your way. Next slide. We move up the evolutionary scale to birds. And what do we find with birds? Well, with birds, the mother lays the eggs, but in this case, the mother stays with the eggs and broods over the eggs, and the mother is there when the eggs hatch. And then the birds actually feed the baby birds. And this will go on for, 2 weeks approximately, depending. How do they feed them? Well, they drop food into the mouth. But what we begin to notice is there's more of a bonding that's taking place. It's shorter, but it's still there. Next slide. Then we go to the mammal world, and we can consider, for example, cats. In this case, we have live births, and we have the female cat staying, and we have the kittens nursing for a period of maybe 6 to 8 weeks. So the bonding period is getting longer. And also the way that the bonding takes place is getting closer. So instead of dropping food into a mouth, like with birds, we're actually nursing from the mother. And then what happens next? Let's look at the next slide. Let's go to humans. Humans are dependent upon their parents for how long? For survival. If reptiles are right away, they're good to go. Birds are a couple of weeks. Mammals, depending, like kittens, 6 to 8 weeks. How long does a human need their parent in order to survive? And we're not talking weeks. We're not even talking months. We're talking years. That bonding or connecting relationship is crucial for humans for an extended period of time. And so what's really interesting to consider, next slide, please, is that the more we evolved, the more we bonded, the more we connected. The bigger our brains got, the bigger our need for bonding and connection became. And so sort of notions that, a fierce independence and self-sufficiency and needing no one is sort of a strong stance to take in life is actually mistaken. The more we evolved and the bigger our brains got, the more the need to connect and bond developed within us. So bonding, connecting, forming relationships is healthy. Of course, we're talking about healthy relationships. It's healthy. It's a part of who we are, and it's a part of what we are as human beings. And it's one of the things that's made us successful as a species on the planet. Next slide. So socialization, I'm talking about bonding and connecting, but socialization was critical to human evolution and survival. And there's 3 reasons for that. There may be more, but think about this. More people for hunting and gathering. When human beings form relationships, form groups, form connections, there's more people to gather food. There's more people to hunt food, and therefore more people to provide food. Absolutely crucial for our survival. There's better protection from predators or from other groups. Again, a lone human being versus predators versus humans in relationships and connected and in groups versus predators, those in groups are going to do better. They're going to survive. It's the way we evolved and it's why we survived. And then we could even think of things like innovation, socialization, or forming social connections allowed us to come together, and there's more people working together for developing tools, developing languages, domestication of livestock, things like that. One individual on their own, these things would never have happened. So our relationships, our socialization made it possible for us to be what we are as a species. It was important in our evolution that we form connections and we form relationships. And so it forms who we are today, and it's a critical part of who we are today. Next slide, please. So how would we define relationships? And I mean, obviously, there's not one right definition. There's all sorts of definitions, all sorts of ways to look at it. One that's simple that I kind of like is it's the way in which two or more people are connected, or the state of being connected. Relationships are about being connected. And again, as human beings, connectedness or having a sense of connection with others is crucial. It's critical. It's how we evolved, and it remains an extremely important factor in how we thrive as humans today. Next slide, please. So what types of human relationships do we have? Well, we have family, we have friendship, we have our colleagues, and we have romantic. And so these are all different ways that we relate. Obviously, friendships are very, very important. And colleagues at family can be more intense. Romantic relationships are usually our closest, but not always. But we relate with people in different ways. And all of these, again, are very, very important for how we function and how we thrive. And soon I'll tie this all into the positive space, but I'm just kind of laying the groundwork for why we would even think of positive space as an important thing, because it's in that context that people can have healthy relationships, whether it's with colleagues, at work, or friends, family, and even romantic. Next slide, please. And so here's kind of a summary of a lot of research that's been done about healthy relationships. People who are more socially connected to family, friends, or their community are happier, they're physically healthier, and live longer. You have fewer mental health problems than people who are less well connected. At the same time, loneliness and isolation remain key predictors for poor psychological and even physical health. So building healthy relationships is absolutely vital. There was some research done that was published in the Harvard Review, I believe, where social isolation, the impact physically on physical health was equivalent to smoking about 15 cigarettes a day. So there's actually physical implications for social isolation, and I would suggest that the psychological implications are even more profound. Next slide, please. Minister of Loneliness. I don't know if you've heard about this, but in 2018, the UK actually appointed a Minister of Loneliness. You would think, why would you hire another minister and pay them all this money and pension, particularly a Minister of Loneliness? What is all that about? Well, social isolation in the UK was costing employers $3.2 billion a year in lost wages. And so there was an enormous impact financially, and the UK recognized that social isolation is this is actually a big issue, and we need to do something about it. So they appointed a minister to look into it and begin to come up with ways to lessen the effects of social isolation. In 2021, Japan followed suit. They appointed a minister of loneliness, and for them it was in order to address rising suicide rates. And again, a social isolation is detrimental to healthy human functioning. So being connected is absolutely critical. Isolation, the opposite of connection, detrimental to human functioning. Next slide, please. And so healthy relationships are exceedingly important, and yet statistics consistently show that 2SLGBTQI plus people are more at risk of feelings of loneliness or of being socially isolated. That's why this becomes important for positive space. Next slide, please. I know there's a lot of content on this slide, and I apologize for that, but I think it's really, really important. as we consider social isolation and its impact upon mental health, as we look at how it impacts a community, although 2S LGBTQI plus people are as diverse as the general Canadian population in their experiences of mental health and well-being, they often face unique challenges, particularly around isolation, and they're at higher risk for a number of mental health issues. So people from the community experience higher rates of depression, anxiety, obsessive compulsive and phobic disorders, suicidal thoughts and acts, self-harm, and substance dependence. People from the community are more likely to experience childhood maltreatment, interpersonal violence, personal loss. They're at double the risk of developing PTSD. They're 2.5 times more likely to have attempted suicide and have a risk of depression and anxiety 1.5 times higher than their peers. Youth from the community have an increased risk of suicide, substance abuse, isolation, and experiencing sexual abuse. One Canadian study estimated that the risk of suicide among LGB youth is 14 times higher than their heterosexual peers, 14 times. A large statistically representative study of trans people in Ontario found that 77% had seriously considered suicide, 77% of trans people in Ontario. 45% had attempted suicide, almost half. Trans youth were at the greatest risk of suicidality, as were those who experienced physical or sexual assault. And what's important to understand is this community is at risk, and it's not because they're 2S LGBTQI+. It's because of the isolation. It's because of sometimes the judgment, the lack of acceptance. It's the impact that our society has upon people in the community that drives these kind of mental health issues. And so once again, creating positive space for people in the community is so important for their health, for their wellness. Healthy relationships for people in the community are extremely, extremely important. Next slide, please. So what can we do? Well, we can do what we're trying to do a little bit of right now. Learn about the community, learn about the history, build relationships, learn how to build relationships and build positive relationships with these people, and then promote positive space. Do what we can in our small corner of the world to promote positive space, whether it's in the workspace, maybe it's in families, with friends, being an ally and being an advocate. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about some of the language and have a little bit of understanding of some different aspects of the community. So sex, gender identity, gender expression, pronouns, how does it all relate? So first of all, we have biological sex. And it's very, very helpful to think about these things on a continuum rather than in a kind of dualistic way or a binary way. It's very, very helpful to think about these things on a continuum. So biological sex is probably, of all of these things, the one we would think of in the most binary way. Well, you're either male or female and there's nothing else. But in fact, there is a continuum to biological sex, and the technical term is intersex, and it's the I in our acronym. Intersex are people that are born with both male and female attributes. And so someone might have an XY chromosome set, which is male, and yet have breasts and have no body hair. They may appear as a female with respect to the genitalia on the outside, but they may have testicles that are on the inside that aren't visible, and yet they may have no uterus, for example. And so there is an actual biological continuum to sex. Yes, the majority of people are born male or female, but it is important to understand there is something called intersex, and it does exist on a spectrum. Sometimes it's very radical, like the situation I described. Sometimes it's less. It might be a male that has no body hair, for example, and has a very high voice and very small Adam's apple, something like that. Generally what happens, and I'm not sure if this is changing, but when babies are born intersex, usually at that time, the doctor assigns a sex and surgeries take place and corrective things are done. Not always, but that's been sort of historically the way that that's been dealt with. The community is fighting against that and saying people should be allowed to choose and find out who they are and make that decision later in life. And I agree with that. So biological sex. So then we have gender identity. And notice the difference in language. We go from male and female to man and woman. So we're talking about sex, we're talking about male and female. When we use the language of gender, now we're using the language of man and woman. So man and male are not necessarily the same thing. And that's where transgender comes in. Gender identity is how one identifies. So they may be biologically a male, but they may identify or feel like in their body a woman. And then that person would identify as a woman, though biologically they may be a male. They may choose to express that in one way or another. Gender identity is so there'll be a transgender woman would be a biological male that identifies as a woman. And it's important when we think of gender to, again, think about it in terms of a spectrum. It's not an either or. One identifies exclusively as a man or a woman. There's gender fluidity. Some identify equally as both or as both to one degree or another. So we have in the Indigenous community, the First Nations people, two-spirited is the language they would use for that. There's a lot of different gender fluid, gender diverse, non-binary. There's a lot of different language around gender identity. But the main thing that I'd like you to consider is that it's on a spectrum. Some may feel very much like a man, but still have parts of them that feel like a woman, or vice versa. And so this thing continues or exists on a continuum. And again, I think that's the most helpful thing that I learned when I was learning these kinds of things. And then we have gender expression. And gender expression is the way one expresses their gender. And it may be in masculine ways, feminine ways, and it's or androgynous, which is neither masculine or feminine, or sometimes both masculine and feminine at the same time. And again, that's on a continuum. It may not be purely masculine or purely feminine. It might be, someone might choose to do it that way, but it may also exist along that continuum. Gender, and the other thing to understand about man, woman, masculine, feminine, and the way we define these things and the way we understand these things, these are all built up out of our culture, right? So it's our culture that has taught us what's masculine, what's feminine. They are cultural constructs, and they are in flux. They do change. What is, the expression? What is feminine expression? What does that look like? If we go back 200 years and compare it to today, we'll find that it probably looks different in a lot of different ways. The clothing that you would wear and so on. So these things are cultural constructs, and they're not written in stone. And that's just one more thing to understand. Okay, next slide, please. And so here's some of the terminology. 2SLGBTQI+, as I said, that is, as of August, the new language that's being used. 2S is two-spirited, and that's a word that comes from the Indigenous community. L is for lesbian, a woman attracted to the same sex, to a woman. Gay, in this particular context, is being used for a male attracted to a male. The word is more of an umbrella term sometimes, can be used for women as well. But here, that's sort of the way it's being used. Bisexual, being attracted to both sexes. Some would say it's being attracted to two or more genders. So maybe a non-binary person, for example, someone who identifies neither as male nor female. Transgender is the T. Transsexual, you may still hear once in a while, but many people in the community have distanced themselves from that word. And so it's not one that I would use. And it tends to, though it doesn't have to, it tends to have connotations of medical intervention or surgeries or something like that. So transgender is the more common term. Transsexual you still may hear, but not as often. Q is queer or questioning. That's probably the most difficult one to define. I think the easiest way to think about queer is is people that are part of the community that may not identify with one of the other labels, or they might, but that label may not, fit them absolutely. And so there are people that like the word queer because it's an umbrella term and it's very inclusive and it can include a lot of different aspects. It had been a derogatory term years ago. So for some, particularly if they're a little older, it may be triggering, but it's still a word that a number of people in the community have championed and kind of taken back. And that's why it's being used. And then the I is intersex, and we've already talked about what that is. LGBT was in use since the 1980s, and then LGBTQ2+ was the previous Canadian version. LGBTI is the international version where the I stands for intersex, and then we have ours where we're seeking to honor the Indigenous community by putting the 2S right up front. And then we can have an ally. That's someone who does not identify with the community but wants to support the community. That would be me. I meant to say that right at the beginning. I am not part of the community, but I am somebody who wants to be an ally. I want to do what I can to be supportive, to eliminate harassment, discrimination, and to create a positive space for people that are in the community. I have friends in the community, and I would identify as an ally. The other thing I meant to say right at the beginning is I'm also not an expert on these things. I'm an advocate, but I'm not an expert. And so I do my best. It's really just something I feel strongly about, and that's why I'm involved. And then there are positive space ambassadors. Those are people within the defense community that are identified as someone who's taken some training and identifies himself openly as someone that wants to be supportive of the 2S LGBTQI+ community. And I'm also one of those. And your workplace may have something similar as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to build on the definitions a bit more. So we have sex, which we've looked at, and then we have the next one, which is the gender identity. Then we have the expression. Then we have one more, which is sexual orientation. And again, like with sex, gender identity, and gender expression, it's helpful to think of sexual orientation as existing on a continuum. And so we have, on the one hand, attracted to women, on the other hand, attracted to men exclusively. And then we have a large continuum in between, so someone could be pansexual, attracted to all genders and all gender identities, bisexual, that can be both man and woman, or it can be both man and woman and other gender identities, depends on how the word's being defined. Asexual, someone with very little or no sexual attraction. Even sexual attraction is on a continuum. Some have very, very strong sexual attraction, some have weaker, some have almost none. And so the main thing is to think about sexual orientation isn't either or, it's not binary. It exists on a continuum. Someone might be mostly attracted to men, but also attracted to women, mostly attracted to women, but also attracted to men. And some are fluid. Sometimes they're attracted to women almost exclusively. Other times they may be attracted to men. For some, there's an emotional component that will determine who they're attracted to. And so it's been helpful for us to learn that these things are not either or, they're not binary, they exist on a continuum, and it gives us a lot better understanding of why there's so many different expressions and why the language continues to grow when we're trying to speak respectively and respectfully of and to people from the community. Next slide, please. And so just take a moment to look at this and ask yourself, this is just a little kind of an exercise to help us wrap our minds around the way language is used. So sex, gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, the four things that we've talked about. And look at these different words, anatomical, what does that belong with? Lesbian, where would you put that? Lived identity, where would you put that? Clothing, that might be a little more obvious. Genitalia, where would you put that? Intersex, asexual. Woman, I think that's a tricky one. Some might put that under sex, but it actually would belong under identity, whereas female would belong under sex, and so on. So man, again, some might put that under sex, but it actually belongs under identity, whereas male would belong under sex. Appearance, makeup, pansexual, gay, curious, transgender, and straight. And so let's see what the answers to these are and see how well you did as you tried to imagine how it went. So there's our sex, there's our identity, our expression, and orientation. So we'll leave that up just for a second so you can take a look and see if you got those right, or if you had any that kind of threw you there. And again, this is just about learning, okay, this is how language is being used. And it gives us a little bit more understanding of how to use language and, as I said, in a respectful way. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about the evolution of 2S LGBTQI plus rights in Canada. I think this is important for us to kind of have an appreciation for where people in the community are coming from and what oppression has looked like for them and how hard they've had to fight for, where they are today. So from the 1800s to the 1960s, being homosexual is illegal. Stigmatization, persecution is the norm. It's against the law. It's a criminal offense to be gay. When we think back on that, it's really, really hard to imagine that it was just up till the 60s. Even in the 60s, this was still a thing. And then in 69, homosexuality was decriminalized. So in 1969, it was no longer a criminal offense to be gay. 1970s, homosexuality is depathologized. So it's removed from the diagnostic list of mental disorders. So there's something called the DSM, and it's basically what psychiatrists will use to diagnose mental disorders. And up till the 70s, being homosexual was considered a mental disorder. So it was depathologized. It was taken out of the list of mental disorder. Homosexuals were no longer barred from immigrating to Canada. Quebec adds sexual orientation to prohibited grounds for discrimination. And that was extremely important when sexual orientation began to become a prohibited grounds for discrimination. Extremely important. And the first Pride parades took place in Montreal and Vancouver. In the 80s, Charter of Rights and Freedoms opens the door to more protection against discrimination. Manitoba, Ontario, and the Yukon passed laws against discrimination regarding sexual orientation. So more provinces are getting on board. You cannot discriminate when it comes to sexual orientation. In the 90s, policies preventing people from the community to serve openly in the military are openly revoked. That was just in the 90s. Discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation is illegal in every province and territory. Now, the key with that is that once you can no longer discriminate based upon sexual orientation, new battles are going to start. Why can't we adopt children then? Right? You can't adopt children because you're a same-sex couple. Oh, wait a minute. You can't discriminate against us based upon our sexual orientation any longer. So you can see where this sets the foundation for the kinds of victories. Well, unfortunately, they had to fight for these things, but it set the groundwork so that those fights were going to be successful. The same-sex couples were awarded the same benefits as common law heterosexual partners in the 1990s. Again, why? Because you can't discriminate against us any longer. And if we're not entitled to the same benefits because we're gay, guess what? That is exactly what discrimination is. Next slide, please. The 2000s, there's a movement to legalize same-sex marriage. We become the fourth nation to do that. And adoption by same-sex couples is legalized in most provinces and territories. In the 2010s, gender identity and gender expression are added to the list of prohibited grounds for discrimination. So that's kind of recent, at least when you're my age, it's kind of recent. Canadian passports offer a third gender option, and the Prime Minister apologizes for the LGBT purge. We'll say a little bit more about that. And the class action lawsuit around the purge is settled. And then in this decade, Bill C-8, ban on conversion therapy, is introduced. In fact, now it's actually been passed. Conversion therapy is illegal. And that was a big one as well. And so the good news is discrimination against people on the grounds of sexual orientation and gender identity and expression became law. Sadly, though, things that should have been obvious, like, well, if you can't discriminate against us, we should get the same benefits. We should be able to adopt. We should be able to marry. That just didn't happen automatically. Those were all hard-won battles that the community had to fight in order to get things that they were clearly entitled to when you're no longer allowed to discriminate. And those things continue to happen in certain ways as well. Next slide, please. And so the purge, for the 50s to 90s, people from the LGBT community that were members of the armed forces, the RCMP, and the public service were systemically discriminated against, harassed, and often fired as a matter of policy and sanctioned practice. There's a documentary called The Fruit Machine that if you want to understand what happened, if you watch that, that is very, very helpful. I can see that our time is running out, so let's keep moving. Next slide, please. Let's build. So the positive space movement and the public service evolution, just keep filling there's a few more. Yeah. This is sort of how positive space initiatives began. So in the 2000s was adopted by the public service, and eventually 2016, 2017, the CAF took it on board. 2020, they decentralized it, and now they're just revamping the program now. So good news that the positive space program exists. Next slide, please. So why do we still need one? Acceptance for people within the community remains very difficult, whether it's acceptance of themselves, by themselves, acceptance from friends, family members, co-workers. There's pressures, cultural pressures. Unfortunately, there's religious pressures. We still have many churches that teach it's wrong or it's sinful or something like that. And so these kinds of programs and creating healthy relationships and making space for that remains very, very important. Next slide, please. A few statistics about it. 57% of people hide who they are at their workplace from the community. 35% feel compelled to lie about their personal lives. 1 in 3 have experienced bullying or derogatory comments in the workplace. 40% have experienced discrimination at work affecting their careers. There's still overt discrimination, but there's also, casual jokes, language being misused, microaggressions. So these things still happen, and they happen at, when you look at the statistics, it's still alarmingly high. Now, those most recent ones are for 2017. Hopefully they've gotten better, but it's still indicative that we need to do something. Next slide, please. A little bit about microaggressions and the roots of them. Cis-sexism. So cisgender is when your gender identity and your biological sex are the same. So I'm cisgender. I'm biologically a male and I identify as a man. Cis-sexism, assumption that everyone should be that way. Heteronormativity or heterosexism, assumption that everyone should be heterosexual. That's the norm. That's the only right way. Homophobia, an aversion to, fear of, or hatred of gay, lesbian, or bisexual people and communities. Transphobia, the same thing, only it's directed towards the transgender community or transgender people. Biphobia, same thing, only directed towards bisexual people. Transmisogyny, this is basically people that believe that if you're born biologically a male and choose to identify as a female, that's about the worst you can get. It's bad enough that your gender and your sex don't match, but it's even worse that you would choose to be a woman when you're biologically male, because there's something inherently inferior about being a woman. Next slide, please. And so just a couple of things about building healthy relationships. Humans have 2 basic attachment or connection needs. I need to know that I'm loved and wanted, and I need to feel that I'm accepted or I'm enough. And when those basic needs are not met, it leads to compromised views of yourself, of other people, and of the world. The world's unsafe. Others are unsafe. I'm unlovable. There's something wrong with me. That has a direct negative impact on health and wellness. And so, next slide, please. The message we want to send, I care about you. You matter to me. That's attachment need 1. I accept you and you are enough. If we get nothing else from the presentation, I think this is the most important thing we can take away. The message I want to send to people in the community and that I want to promote for people in the community. I care about you. You matter. I accept you for who you are. When people feel cared for and accepted, it contributes positively to wellness outcomes. Next slide, please. An easy way to think about it is the R trilogy. I'm accessible, I'm responsive, and I'm engaged. I'm accessible, I'm here if you need me. Responsive, I'm listening to you. I'm not judging you. I'm not even trying to give you answers. I'm here, I'm listening, and I'm engaged. What do you need from me? How can I be supportive for you? Very simple shorthand to think about. What can I do? I learn about the community, and then I'm there. I listen, I'm engaged, and I offer my support. I let them know I care for you, and I accept you for who you are. Next slide, please. So creating healthy relationships. When people experience us as available, responsive, and engaged, we send the message that we care about them and that we accept them. And as an aside, we don't need to agree with someone to care about them or accept them. We don't need to understand somebody to care about them and accept them. We accept them as human beings, as fellow human beings. And most people need love and acceptance more than they need advice. So true. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the last slide. And so the defense team does have a positive space program. There may be a positive space program where you work. If there is, and you feel comfortable with it, I really encourage you to get involved. If there's not, maybe you could speak up and say, hey, maybe we can have a positive space program. And then what can you do with family, with friends, with people in the community, wherever you can have some influence? Be that loving, caring, accepting individual. Don't get all worried about the language. Some of it can be confusing, and sometimes we'll say the wrong thing. Sometimes we'll get things wrong. What I would say, again, I'm not a member of the community, but what I would say is be loving, be respectful, be accepting. And even if you make a blunder sometimes, you'll still be the kind of person that will make people feel accepted and valued and cared for. And that, to me, particularly this is coming from my background as a therapist, that's what's needed. So whether it's happening in official and formal positive space programs, or whether it's happening by us doing our small part to make people feel welcome and to foster and encourage healthy, healing, wholesome relationships. Let's do what we can, and let's be a force for good. Okay, well, I hope that didn't seem too rushed. I saw this morning that we only had 5 minutes left. I didn't know if this was all going to disappear, so I wanted to make sure we got to the end. People can feel free to reach out to me. I don't mind if my email address is shared. They're welcome to do that. If I can be helpful in any way, I'm glad to do it. Or if I connect people with resources, I'm glad to do that. And thank you, everyone, for your time. Thanks for listening, and I really hope you got something helpful and something that will help you be helpful to other people. Thanks.
Thank you, Lieutenant Commander Irwin. We appreciate your time tonight and all the information that you shared with us. I really, really love that message that, that you said, if you take anything away, I care about you, you matter, and I accept you for who you are. That's really powerful. So thank you so much. So for individuals who are looking for more information regarding healthy relationship campaigns and also some information on how to contact Lieutenant Commander Irwin, we will be sharing that information when we with this video and also on our website and through our means of communication with the community. So thank you so much. Take care. Have a great night.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.